The air in the auditorium was thick with the sterile scent of filtered air and false ambition. Row upon row of my colleagues sat polished and attentive, a sea of nodding heads under the blinding glare of the stage lights. At the podium, Mr. Sterling was in his element, a maestro conducting an orchestra of his own ego. I sat in the front row as requested, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, a silent alarm I had chosen to ignore. I should have known. I had built my career on reading the subtle shifts in a room, but today I was blind. His smile, usually a sharp, calculated gesture, was a little too wide, his eyes holding a glint I mistook for excitement. Then he called my name. For a fleeting, foolish moment I thought it was for an accolade. I climbed the steps, my heels echoing in the sudden expectant hush. He placed a heavy, patronizing arm around my shoulder, his voice dripping with faux camaraderie through the microphone. "Lydia here has been with us for 10 years, he boomed, and the crowd offered a smattering of polite applause. Then his grip tightened. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, theatrical disappointment. But loyalty without integrity is a liability. The words hit me like a physical blow, sucking the air from my lungs. He detailed a minor, fabricated oversight, twisting it into a tale of gross incompetence. My world shrank to the spotlights burning my skin and the hundreds of pairs of eyes widening in shock and morbid curiosity. "Effective immediately," he concluded, his voice ringing with finality. "Your employment here is terminated. Security will escort you out." He had fired me on stage, turning my professional funeral into his primetime spectacle. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound filled only by the shattering of my spirit. But in that devastating silence from the back of the room, a single unnoticed smartphone screen glowed, its red recording light a tiny, defiant ember in the dark. That ember was about to become a wildfire. The air in the grand auditorium was a carefully calibrated substance, a blend of chilled, recirculated oxygen and the warm, anxious exhalations of 300 souls. It was the atmosphere of high-stakes theater, where every rustle of a program, every soft cough, was a punctuation mark in the silent, collective narrative of corporate ambition. For a decade I had been a part of this ritual, a loyal acolyte in the temple of Sterling Global. I knew its scent, its sounds, the particular way the light from the massive crystal chandeliers refracted off the polished mahogany stage, casting long, dramatic shadows. Today the shadows felt deeper, more profound, as if they were pools of ink waiting to swallow something whole. I sat in the front row, a place of honor I had earned through years of late nights and sacrificed weekends, my posture perfect, my new navy blue suit feeling less like armor and more like a costume for a role whose script I had not yet been given. My heart, however, was a traitor to this composed exterior. It hammered against my ribs, a frantic, caged bird sensing a storm I could not yet see. The feeling had been a low hum all morning, a dissonant string in the symphony of the quarterly all-hands meeting. I dismissed it as pre-presentation jitters, even though I was not scheduled to speak. Mr. Alistair Sterling had personally requested my presence in the front row. "I have something special planned, Lydia," he'd said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone over the phone the previous evening. "A recognition of your dedication. Be visible." Those words, which should have been a bomb, now felt like a lie I had told myself. I replayed them, searching for a hidden edge, a tonal shift I had missed in my eager pride. There was nothing, only the memory of his practiced, avuncular warmth. He commanded the stage, a silhouette of sharp tailoring and groomed silver hair against the massive, glowing screen displaying the company's soaring profit margins. He was a master of this particular art form, the corporate sermon. He spoke of family, of grit, of the relentless pursuit of excellence, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of a revivalist preacher. The audience, my colleagues and friends, were his congregation, their faces upturned, absorbing his every word. They laughed at his rehearsed, self-deprecating jokes. They nodded solemnly at his pronouncements on market disruption. I watched him, this man I had respected, feared, and tirelessly worked to please, and I saw only the familiar, brilliant performer. But then a flicker. As he paused to sip from his glass of water, his eyes scanned the front row and landed on me. It was not the glance of a mentor about to bestow an honor. It was colder, more assessing, like a sculptor examining a block of marble before the first defining strike of the chisel. A shiver, fine and sharp as a sliver of ice, traced its way down my spine. I told myself it was the aggressive air conditioning. I told myself I was imagining things, that the latent paranoia of a high-pressure career was finally manifesting. He was Alistair Sterling, the visionary. I was Lydia Vance, his head of strategic communications, the architect of his public voice. We were a team. The moment the thought solidified in my mind, he proved it false. And that, he boomed, concluding a point about innovative leverage, brings me to a more delicate matter. A matter of values. The shift in his tone was subtle, a drop in temperature of a single degree, but to me it felt arctic. The room seemed to lean in, a collective, unconscious intake of breath. We preach accountability. We preach transparency. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, pregnant with new ominous meaning. But sometimes the people who preach these values the loudest are the ones who fail to live them. My palms began to sweat. I clasped them tightly in my lap, my knuckles bleaching white. Don't be ridiculous, I chastised myself. This is about someone else. The compliance department. A regional manager. Anyone but you. Lydia. His voice softened, became almost sorrowful. Lydia Vance, could you please join me on stage? The sound of my own name was a trigger. For a single heart-stopping second the world went silent and still. Then a wave of heat washed over me, followed immediately by a chill. The polite, expectant applause began. A sound that now felt mocking, percussive. It was the sound of a drumroll leading to an execution. My legs, made of lead and rubber, somehow obeyed. I rose, a smile stapled to my face. A reflex, a pathetic attempt to pretend this was normal, that this was the honor I had been promised. The walk to the stage steps was the longest of my life. Each click of my heel on the polished concrete floor echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. I could feel the weight of every gaze. 300 pairs of eyes dissecting my every movement. I saw curiosity, confusion, and in a few, a dawning, horrified understanding. I climbed the 3 steps to the stage, the lights blinding me, reducing the vast audience to a dark, shapeless mass. The air up here was different, hotter, thinner, charged with a strange, cruel energy. Sterling moved towards me, his smile a tight, grim line. He placed a heavy arm around my shoulders, pulling me close in a parody of camaraderie. His grip was too tight, possessive. I could smell his cologne, a scent I had once found sophisticated, now cloying and oppressive. This woman, he began, his voice resonating through the speakers, dripping with a paternalistic tone that made my skin crawl, has been with Sterling Global for 10 years. A decade of her life. She has been more than an employee. She has been the voice of this company. A flicker of hope, desperate and foolish, ignited in my chest. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps this was real. But his next words extinguished it utterly. But a voice, he continued, his tone shifting from paternal to prosecutorial. That is not in harmony with the truth is nothing but noise. And loyalty, my friends, without integrity, is a liability. The words were a physical blow. A punch to the solar plexus that stole my breath. The air left my lungs in a silent, ragged gasp. Liability. The word echoed, monstrous and final. He then proceeded to dismantle me. He spoke of a recent minor communications delay with a key client. A delay he had personally caused by refusing to sign off on copy for days, a fact I had documented in a dozen emails. He twisted it, contorted it into a tale of gross negligence, of a failure to uphold the core tenets of our client-first philosophy. He spoke in vague, damning generalities about a misalignment with company culture, and a concerning pattern of isolated decision-making. He was not just firing me. He was erasing me. He was systematically dismantling my professional identity, brick by brick, in front of the very people whose respect I had spent a decade earning. I stood there, trapped in the vice of his arm, a living prop in his brutal theater. My vision blurred at the edges, the spotlight burning my retinas. I could see individual faces now in the front rows. Sarah from marketing, her hand flying to her mouth. Ben from accounting staring at his shoes in shame. The new intern wide-eyed with the horror of this corporate bloodsport. The humiliation was a living thing. A creature with sharp teeth gnawing at my insides. It was a profound, soul-scouring exposure. I was a specimen, pinned to a board for everyone to examine in my moment of utter destruction. My mind raced, A frantic animal seeking an escape that did not exist. Should I speak? Should I refute his lies, scream my truth into the microphone? But the shock had frozen my vocal cords. The power dynamic was absolute. He held the microphone. He held the stage. He held all the power. And so, he concluded, his voice dropping to a somber, regretful note that was the most insulting part of the entire performance. It is with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience, that I must announce that Lydia's employment with Sterling Global is terminated. Effective immediately. He finally released his grip, his arm sliding from my shoulders as if shedding something unclean. He took a small step back, formally distancing himself from the ruin he had created. Security will escort you from the building. The finality of it. The clinical public summoning of security, as if I were a thief, a violent threat. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was a vacuum. A void so complete it felt like a physical pressure on my eardrums. It was a silence of collective shock, of complicit shame, of breath held in 300 lungs. In that silence I was completely, utterly alone. The world had shrunk to this circle of blinding light, the cold, satisfied eyes of Alistair Sterling, and the crushing weight of my own shattered dignity. I felt the hot sting of tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give him that. With a strength I did not know I possessed, I lifted my chin, turned my back on him, and took the first step toward the stairs, my body moving on some ancient autonomic instinct of survival. The walk down was even longer than the walk up. Every step was a monumental effort. I did not look at anyone. I could not. I was a ghost already, passing through a world that had just been erased. I focused on the double doors at the back of the auditorium, my promised land of escape, though I knew they led only to the final, walking shame of being paraded past the cubicles by a uniformed guard. But as I descended, my gaze, unfocused and swimming, passed over the darkened back row. And there, for a fraction of a second, I saw it. A tiny glowing red eye in the darkness. A single point of light on a smartphone screen, held steady in a steady hand. An ember in the ashes. The silence was the first thing that registered. A thick, suffocating blanket thrown over the auditorium. It was a silence born not of peace, but of collective shock. A vacuum where sound had been murdered. Into that void a single traitorous thought echoed in Maya's mind. This isn't right. The thought was a spark, small and desperate, threatening to be extinguished by the overwhelming pressure of the moment. She sat, frozen, in the very last row. Her body pressed into the plush velvet of the seat as if trying to become one with the shadows. From this vantage point, the stage was a diorama of brutal power. A perfectly framed scene of a career's execution. She saw Lydia Vance, a woman she'd only ever seen in company-wide emails or striding purposefully through the executive floor. A figure of unattainable competence and polished grace. Now that woman stood under the merciless glare of the stage lights, her posture rigid, her face a mask trying and failing to contain a cataclysm of humiliation. And towering over her was Alistair Sterling, his voice, usually an instrument of charismatic command, now a weapon, each word a carefully chosen blade designed not just to cut, but to dismember a reputation built over a decade. Maya's fingers, resting on her thigh, began to tremble. She was a junior data analyst, 2 months into her first job out of college, a speck in the corporate machine. Her world was one of spreadsheets and silent cubicles, not boardroom dramas or public shamings. She had no stake in this, no personal loyalty to Lydia Vance. But what was happening transcended office politics. It was a violation of a deeper, more fundamental code. It was cruel. It was unjust. It was, in a word she whispered only to herself, evil. The weight of 300 other colleagues pressed in on her. A silent, complicit audience. No one moved. No one spoke. A few shifted uncomfortably, studying their hands or the pattern on the carpet, as if it held the secrets of the universe. This passive acceptance, this collective cowardice, fanned the spark inside her into a small, defiant flame. Someone should bear witness. This should not be allowed to happen in the dark, to be memory hold as just another Tuesday at Sterling Global. It needed a record. A testament. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. A sleek black rectangle that felt suddenly heavy with potential and peril. To take it out was an act of rebellion. It was a breach of unwritten rules. A shattering of the fourth wall in Sterling's carefully staged theater of power. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that she was sure was audible in the profound silence. What if someone saw her? What if Sterling's hawk-like gaze, currently fixed on his prey, swept to the back of the room and caught the glow of the screen? Her internship would be over. Her career barely begun would be ashes. The fear was a cold, physical presence coiling in her stomach. But then Sterling spoke again, his voice dripping with a faux sorrow that was more insulting than his outright anger. Loyalty without integrity is a liability. The phrase, so clean, so corporate, so utterly devoid of the human wreckage it was causing, severed her last thread of hesitation. With a movement so slow it felt like a dream, she slipped her hand into her pocket. The fabric whispered. Her fingers closed around the cool, hard case. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to be prudent, to be quiet, to be a good cog in the machine. She pulled the phone out, keeping it low, cradled in her lap, hidden by the curve of the seat in front of her. The screen lit up her face for a terrifying second, and she hunched her shoulders, making herself smaller. Her thumb, slick with sweat, fumbled across the glass. She found the camera app. The world shrunk to the few inches of her screen. She tapped the record button. A small red dot appeared. A tiny pulsating heart of truth in a sea of lies. She angled the phone, her hands now steady, a rock in the storm of her own anxiety. The frame on the screen captured it all. The blinding expanse of the stage, Sterling's broad, powerful back, and Lydia, pale and shock-still, trapped in the circle of his arm. The microphone picked up every syllable, every pregnant pause, every ounce of condescension in Sterling's voice. It was not just recording video and audio. It was capturing the very essence of the moment, the tension, the injustice, the raw, unvarnished abuse of power. Maya became a conduit, her own breathing shallow and quiet, her entire being focused on the task of holding the phone steady. She was no longer just Maya, the junior analyst. She was an archivist of a crime, a silent sentinel for the truth. She watched through the screen as Sterling delivered the final brutal blow. "Security will escort you from the building." She saw Lydia's chin lift, a gesture of breathtaking defiance in the face of total annihilation. She saw her turn, the movement graceful even in its devastation, and begin the long, slow, harrowing walk down the stage steps and up the central aisle. The phone followed her. The lens became a single, compassionate eye in a room full of averted gazes. It captured the way Lydia's shoulders were set, a ramrod straight line of pride that refused to break. It captured the absolute silence, a silence so profound that the soft scuff of Lydia's heels on the carpet was like thunder. It captured the faces in the crowd as she passed, the pity, the shame, the morbid curiosity, the sheer relief that it was not them. Maya kept recording as Lydia neared the back doors, as a uniformed security guard, his face a blank slate of procedure, materialized to meet her. She recorded until the doors swung shut, swallowing Lydia Vance whole, and the spell in the auditorium was broken by the clearing of Sterling's throat, ready to move on as if he had simply taken out the trash. Only then, her hands trembling once more, her heart aching with a strange, vicarious grief and a burning fury, did she press the stop button. The red dot vanished. The screen went black, reflecting her own pale, determined face back at her. In her hand, she held not just a video file, but a live grenade. It was evidence. It was a weapon. It was potential energy waiting to be unleashed upon the world. She had no plan, no grand design for what came next. All she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, was that the story Alistair Sterling had just told was not the true one. The true story was now stored in the memory of her phone, a digital ghost waiting for its moment to speak. She slipped the device back into her pocket, its weight now feeling not like a risk, but like a responsibility. The air in the room was already shifting, Sterling's voice regaining its confident boom, the audience tentatively re-engaging, the horrific spectacle already beginning to recede into the realm of uncomfortable memory. But Maya sat still, apart from them all, the silent keeper of the one thing that could change everything. The ember was in her pocket, and it was still glowing. The phone felt like a stolen artifact, a piece of contraband that pulsed with a dangerous energy against her thigh. For the rest of the meeting, Maya sat in a bubble of surreal disconnect. Alistair Sterling's voice, once more booming with visionary pronouncements, now sounded tinny and false, the words of a man who had just committed a perfect crime in front of 300 witnesses and believed he had gotten away with it. The applause that occasionally rippled through the audience felt like a series of small physical blows. How could they clap? How could they sit there and absorb his leadership platitudes after what they had just seen? The cognitive dissonance was a scream in her mind that no one else seemed to hear. When the meeting was finally adjourned, she moved with the herd, a numb body in a river of chattering colleagues. The conversations around her were hushed, speculative, a frantic buzz of gossip trying to make sense of the brutality. Did you see her face? I heard she leaked documents to a competitor. No, I heard it was a massive accounting error, that she almost cost us the Axiom contract. The lies were already sprouting, fertilized by the toxic seeds Sterling had so deliberately planted. The true story, the one of a calculated public annihilation, was already being buried under a landslide of whispered speculation. It was this, the rapid erosion of truth, that solidified her resolve. The recording was not just a document. It was a tether to reality. Back in the sterile silence of her cubicle, the world outside her small partition seemed to hum with a normalcy that was utterly profane. She pulled out the phone, its sleek surface now seeming to hold a malevolent life of its own. She plugged in her headphones, her hands trembling as she navigated to the video file. Hitting play was like reopening a wound. There it was, in devastating high definition. The smug, theatrical sorrow on Sterling's face. The way his arm tightened around Lydia's shoulders. A gesture not of camaraderie but of possession and control. The microscopic flinch in Lydia's eye as he said liability. A detail she had missed in the live horror of it. The absolute, gut-wrenching silence that followed the termination. A silence the microphone picked up as a low, mournful hum. And then the walk. Watching it again from this detached perspective was somehow worse. Her camera, followed Lydia's journey with an unblinking, pitiless eye, capturing the devastating geography of that walk, from the bright hell of the stage, down the steps into the purgatory of the aisle, past the sea of stunned and shameful faces, towards the final judgment of the double doors. It was a 5-minute masterpiece of human cruelty. She watched it once, twice, a third time, each viewing hardening a core of steel within her. This could not be allowed to disappear. The question was how. Her personal social media accounts were a curated collection of family photos and memes, a digital backyard fence seen by a few hundred friends. To drop this thermonuclear truth bomb there felt both too exposing and too small. It would be like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. It needed anonymity. It needed scale. It needed a platform where context was immediate and judgment was swift. She thought of VeritasNet, a video-sharing site known for its raw, unfiltered content and its hive-mind ability to dissect and disseminate truth. A digital mob that could be terrifying but, in this case, felt like the only possible court of appeal. Creating a throwaway account was the work of moments, a fake name, a burner email. The username she chose, almost without thinking, was at witness for Lydia. It was simple, direct, and placed the focus exactly where it belonged. Uploading the file felt like rolling a live grenade across the internet. The progress bar filled with agonizing slowness. When it was done, the video sat there raw and unadorned in the upload field. It needed a title. She typed, her fingers striking the keys with a firm final pressure. CEO Alistair Sterling of Sterling Global fires employee in the most cruel way possible. The description was just the facts, a stark transcript of the event. Recorded at the company-wide quarterly meeting. This is Lydia Vance, a 10-year employee, being publicly humiliated and terminated by CEO Alistair Sterling for a minor, fabricated oversight. This is what corporate culture looks like. She added the hashtags. Hashtag Sterling Global, hashtag corporate bullying, hashtag I stand with Lydia. She took a deep breath, a last moment of hesitation where the weight of her current, safe life warred with the pull of a greater justice. Then she clicked post. The first hour was a deafening silence. She refreshed the page obsessively, her anxiety a coiling snake in her gut. 10 views. 20. A few comments trickled in. Wow, that's brutal. Who does this guy think he is? It was a trickle, not a flood. She felt a crushing sense of anticlimax. The grenade had landed in a field and failed to detonate. The internet was a vast, noisy ocean, and her tiny vessel was being swallowed by the waves. She went home, the phone burning a hole in her back, and tried to sleep, convinced she had risked everything for nothing. But in the dark, digital alleys of the web, the mechanisms of virality were beginning to stir. A popular account dedicated to calling out toxic workplace cultures, @OfficeTruth with 500,000 followers, stumbled upon it. The anonymous admin, a former victim of a similar humiliation, felt a jolt of visceral recognition. They didn't just retweet it, they quoted it with a single searing line. "This is one of the most disgusting displays of power I have ever seen. This CEO is a monster." That was the spark. The @OfficeTruth retweet was a signal flare seen by thousands. From there, it was a chain reaction of outrage. Other major accounts in the business, ethics, and even pop culture spheres picked it up. "The sheer glee in his eyes as he destroys her," wrote one commentator. "The silence in that room is the sound of cowardice," wrote another. By the next morning, the trickle had become a tidal wave. The video was no longer just on Veritasnet. It was clipped, screenshotted, and memed across every major social media platform. It was the first thing people saw when they opened their apps. The view counter on the original post was a spinning, incomprehensible blur of numbers. First 100,000, then 1,000,000, then 5. The comments section was a firestorm of collective fury. Thousands shared their own stories of workplace bullying, of petty tyrants and public shaming, seeing their pain reflected in Lydia's stoic, crumbling face. The hashtag I stand with Lydia began trending nationally, a digital chorus of support that transformed the anonymous woman on screen into a symbol for every employee who had ever been made to feel small. News outlets, initially the digital gossip blogs and then the mainstream financial and global news networks, pounced. They couldn't ignore the traffic, the raw, emotional power of the story. Headlines blared. Viral video shows CEO's shocking public firing. Sterling Global in firestorm over cruel termination. The face of corporate evil? The video was played on cable news, analyzed by pundits, dissected by body language experts who pointed out Sterling's micro-expressions of satisfaction, and Lydia's visible fight-or-flight response. The ember Maya had carefully carried and then released into the digital wind had not just started a fire, it had ignited a continent-spanning blaze, a roaring inferno of public judgment that was now raging entirely out of her control, its flames licking at the pristine, untouchable gates of Sterling Global. The fire, once a digital conflagration confined to the screens of the outraged public, began to seek real-world fuel, and it found it in the cold, hard logic of the market. The first tremors were felt not in the hallways of Sterling Global, but on the trading floors. The ticker symbol SGLB, once a steady blue-chip beacon, began to stutter and fall when the markets opened. It wasn't a crash, not at first. It was a slow, sickening slide. A loss of confidence that bled out in points and fractions. The initial wave of selling was driven by algorithms sensitive to negative news sentiment, but it was quickly followed by human hands. Institutional investors, their risk management teams spooked by the horrific optics and the potential for lasting brand damage, began quietly liquidating positions. The board of Sterling Global, who had initially dismissed the video as a regrettable internal matter, watched their screens in mounting horror. By the end of the first trading day, the stock had shed 8% of its value, erasing hundreds of millions in market capitalization in a silent electronic massacre. Alistair Sterling's worth, tied inextricably to the company's stock, plummeted alongside it. The first cracks in his impregnable fortress were not made of stone and mortar, but of digits and decimals. Then came the clients. They did not call Alistair Sterling. They called their account managers, their voices laced with a cold, pragmatic fury. The CEO's behavior, they argued, was not just a personal failing. It was a proxy for corporate culture, a glaring red flag for governance, and a profound reputational liability. Who would want to be associated with a company led by a man who treated his most senior staff like disobedient children on a public stage? The first to leave was Axiom Partners, their flagship account and Sterling's proudest trophy. Their terse two-sentence email, citing a fundamental misalignment of values, was a cannon shot across the bow. It was followed in quick succession by a string of other major clients, each departure announced with a press release that was immediately picked up by the business press and gleefully amplified by the online mob. The narrative was shifting from "look at this horrible man" to "this horrible man is a business risk." The very leadership qualities Sterling had once sold as decisive and uncompromising were now being framed as toxic and unhinged. The conference rooms, once stages for his domineering brilliance, now hosted emergency meetings filled with panicked executives and grim-faced lawyers. The air was thick with the scent of fear and recrimination. Sterling, holed up in his corner office, initially responded with bluster, demanding counteroffensives and legal threats against the libelous online mob. But the bluster was met with silence from his cowed subordinates and, increasingly, with wary caution from his own board. The power he had so publicly wielded was leaching away, siphoned off by the relentless tide of public opinion. As the company bled clients in value, the Internet's hive mind, now a global detective agency, turned its attention to Alistair Sterling himself. The video was the entry point, the key that unlocked his past. Former employees, emboldened by the anonymity of the web and the shield of collective outrage, began to emerge from the shadows. Their stories, shared in long, detailed threads on professional forums and in the comments sections of news articles, formed a chilling pattern. There was the marketing director who was forced to stand in a corner during a meeting for presenting suboptimal data. The pregnant executive who was systematically sidelined, and her responsibilities stripped away after she announced her news. The junior associate who had a panic attack after Sterling screamed at him for a formatting error, and was then fired for lacking the temperament for a high-pressure environment. These were not isolated incidents. They were chapters in a manual of managerial terror. A hashtag Sterling stories began to trend, creating a sprawling public archive of his abuses. Meanwhile, investigative journalists, sensing a Pulitzer-worthy story, began digging. They unearthed lawsuits that had been quietly settled with strict non-disclosure agreements, their details now ominously hinted at. They tracked down former business partners who spoke, cautiously at first and then more freely, of Sterling's win-at-all-costs mentality and his habit of claiming sole credit for collective successes. The polished visionary facade presented in his corporate bio and glossy magazine profiles was being chipped away, revealing the petty, vindictive, and deeply insecure man beneath. The final, most damning unraveling occurred in his personal life. The relentless scrutiny proved too much for the carefully maintained fiction of his perfect existence. A paparazzo shot a photo of him leaving his Manhattan penthouse, his face a grim mask, while his wife, Celeste, was photographed separately a day later, leaving a luxury hotel, her face puffy, her left hand conspicuously bare of its customary diamond wedding band. The gossip sites, which had initially ignored the business story, pounced on this new, juicier angle. "Sterling's wife flees mansion," the headlines screamed. Sources close to the family leaked stories of his volcanic temper at home, his psychological manipulations, his absences. The man who had built an empire on the image of control was now losing control of everything: his company, his reputation, and his family. He became a prisoner in his own home, besieged by reporters, a global pariah. The board of directors, watching the complete evisceration of the company's brand and the evaporation of its market value, was forced to act. A secret weekend meeting was convened, from which Sterling was pointedly excluded. The debate was not about if but how. The public demanded a scalp, and the shareholders demanded a recovery. He was no longer an asset. He was the liability he had so publicly accused Lydia of being. The end, when it came, was delivered not with a theatrical flourish on a stage, but in a sterile 10-minute conference call. The board chairman, a man Sterling had considered a friend and ally, spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. He cited the catastrophic loss of shareholder value, the irreparable damage to the company's reputation, and the growing body of evidence suggesting a pattern of behavior incompatible with the role of chief executive officer. He was asked, for the good of the company, to tender his immediate resignation. There would be a generous but confidential severance package, contingent on his silence. The alternative was a public, messy, and undoubtedly lost vote of no confidence. The phone line was silent for a long moment. The power had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. The man who had fired a loyal employee in front of hundreds was now being fired himself, in the most humiliatingly corporate way possible, by the very institution he had built. He hung up without a word. The news hit the wires an hour later, causing a momentary, ironic spike in Sterling Global's stock price. The king was dead. The Internet had broken him piece by piece, until nothing was left but the wreckage of his own monstrous ego. For Lydia Vance, the days following the execution were a slow, painful submersion into a private abyss. The world had witnessed her humiliation, but she alone had to endure the chilling silence that followed. The initial shock was a physical thing, a numbness that shielded her from the full brunt of the pain. She moved through her apartment like a ghost, the echo of Sterling's voice a constant, taunting soundtrack in her mind. Liability. The word was a brand, seared onto her professional soul. The shame was a heavy, wet cloak she could not remove. She deleted her professional networking apps, unable to bear the thought of the pitying or curious messages that would surely be flooding in. She ignored her phone, letting it ring out into the void, a symbol of a life that had been abruptly and violently disconnected. Her world, once defined by boardrooms and strategic initiatives, had shrunk to the four walls of her living room, where the dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, indifferent to her ruin. She replayed the walk down the aisle 1,000 times, each time finding a new moment of cringing humiliation, a different face in the crowd that she was sure was smirking. She was a cautionary tale, a meme, a piece of public property, and the violation of it all was a nausea she could not shake. The first fissure in this wall of despair came not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet, persistent ping from her laptop. Against her better judgment, a full 48 hours after the event, she opened her email. The inbox was a chaotic flood, a digital mirror of the roaring internet mob. But as she began to sift through it, a different story emerged from the noise. Buried amongst the spam and the few gloating messages from old rivals, were emails with subject lines that made her breath catch. Not a liability, a leader. Your grace under fire. We see you, Lydia. They were from former colleagues, yes, but also from complete strangers, other executives, HR professionals, women who had been in the business for decades. They spoke not of pity, but of solidarity. They shared their own stories, not of public firings, but of private slights, of being talked over, of having ideas stolen, of the slow, grinding erosion of confidence that women in particular were expected to endure. They saw in her very public shattering a reflection of their own quiet battles. One email from a CEO of a rival tech firm was particularly direct. What Sterling intended as a demonstration of his power was, in fact, a demonstration of his profound weakness. You displayed a strength he will never comprehend. When you are ready, I would like to speak with you. Then came the #IStandWithLydia movement. A friend, unable to reach her by phone, finally came over and gently showed her the hashtag trending on a global platform. With trembling hands, Lydia scrolled. There were the expected outraged comments about Sterling, but what undid her, what finally broke the dam of her composure and released the tears she had been holding back for days, were the messages directed at her. Artwork depicting her as a warrior queen, her stoic face from the video transformed into a symbol of resilience. Stories from baristas, teachers, and nurses who saw their own bullying bosses in Sterling, and saw their own desired strength in her. A famous novelist tweeted, Lydia Vance didn't just lose a job, she conducted a masterclass in dignity. The most powerful person in that room was the one being fired. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, not by a corporate PR team but by the world. She was being transformed from a victim into a symbol. The label of liability was being publicly, forcefully, and collectively ripped away and replaced with a new one. Survivor. Icon. The shame began to recede, not all at once, but like a tide going out, leaving behind the solid ground of a truth she had forgotten, that her worth was not, and had never been, determined by Alistair Sterling. The job offers began to materialize not as formal letters, but as personal appeals. Headhunters who had once courted her now approached with a new, almost reverent tone. They weren't just offering a job, they were offering a platform, a redemption. A visionary startup in the ethical AI space, its mission statement a direct repudiation of Sterling Global's culture, offered her the role of Chief Communications Officer with a simple pitch. Help us build a company where what happened to you could never happen. The compensation package was double what Sterling had paid her. A nonprofit dedicated to workplace dignity offered her a seat on their board. A media company wanted to discuss a potential podcast on modern leadership. The world was not just offering her a way back in. It was offering her a promotion to a higher league, one where integrity was the most valuable currency. The power had utterly shifted. She was no longer a supplicant in the job market. She was a prize. The final, profound moment of vindication came the day the news broke of Sterling's resignation. She read the article on her screen, the cold corporate language detailing his decision to step down to pursue other interests. There was no spectacle for him, no public stage, only the sterile humiliation of a conference call and a carefully worded press release designed to save a shred of face for the corporation. The man who had believed his power was absolute had been utterly broken by the consequences of a single cruel act. Lydia felt no jubilation, no schadenfreude. Instead, she felt a quiet, immense and settling calm. It was the feeling of a cosmic balance being restored. The universe had not just righted a wrong. It had created a new equation where her dignity was worth more than his entire empire. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city where Sterling Global's tower still pierced the sky. It no longer looked like a monument to a man's invincibility, but like a tombstone. She, on the other hand, was untethered, free, and more powerful than she had ever been. The silence in her apartment was no longer the silence of shame, but the fertile silence of a future waiting to be born. A future she would define entirely on her own terms. The internet had broken the man who broke her, and in doing so, it had not just given her her life back. It had handed her a version of it she had never dared to imagine.